This is a tutorial for Adobe After Effects CS6. By the end of this tutorial, you should have a firm understanding of the capabilities of After Effects, from animating still objects in two-dimensional space, to working with footage in three-dimensional space, to adding cameras and particle effects. This tutorial covers a whole lot of information in a very short amount of time, so in order to follow along effectively, it may be necessary to pause and even replay the video in some parts in order to fully understand each concept. We'll start with the basics. This is what After Effects looks like when you first open it. You begin with a series of empty tabbed windows, including your project window, your timeline window, and your composition window. In After Effects, the end product of your creation is referred to as a composition, so think of the composition as your project. In order to begin our project in After Effects, we must import the files we plan to use in our project. Go to your project window, right-click, and go to Import Files. Select your files in the import window, in our case the images and video folders, and choose Open. Your files will appear in your project window. After Effects works with transparency, so if you have an image like our astronaut, you'll see the background appears black. If you click this transparency icon in the composition window, you'll see the black part is actually transparent. Notice that when we double-clicked our astronaut, it opened the image in a new window. It's important to recognize that this is a file independent from the main composition, just to keep ourselves oriented. If you continue double-clicking each of the files, we also have an Earth map image, a metal texture, and a stars image. Let's start our composition. Right-click in the project window and choose New Composition. We're going to call it Space Project. Here we have the opportunity to change our settings of our composition, but for now we're going to stick with our HD TV preset. Let's set our duration to 2 minutes and make the background color black. Now we've created a composition. We can see it in our project bin as well as in our timeline. Just to stay organized, I'm going to create a new bin in my project window specifically for my compositions by right-clicking and choosing New Bin. Now you see we have 2 minutes on our timeline, and we can use our time indicator to scrub through. However, since we haven't done anything yet, nothing's happening yet. Go ahead and drop our stars image into our composition. When we drop an image into our comp, we have the ability to move it around in our composition space. If you come down to our stars image in our timeline, you see you have a drop-down menu. If you click on it and then click on the arrow next to transform, you'll see you have all of your transform options. If you change the values of these transform options, you'll see the result of the change in the composition window. You can change the position, the anchor point, which references the little target in the middle of the image, the scale, the rotation, and the opacity. You can also do all of these things in the composition window using the arrow tool, but the timeline provides you with a numeric reference. I'm just going to scale this image out until it fits the composition window so that we have a nice starry background. Now I'm going to put in our astronaut. Where I put him in the project window matters. If I put him below the stars image, he's not going to show because the stars image is not transparent and it's taking up the entire composition. When I put him on top, you can see the stars image shows up behind him because the space around the astronaut is transparent. So just like with the stars image, I have the ability to transform the astronaut image by changing his position, rotation, etc. First thing I want to do is head up to my toolbar and choose the Pan Behind tool. This tool allows you to change the anchor point within the composition. So I'm going to use the Pan Behind tool to click on the anchor point and drag it to the chest of my astronaut because this will act as a much more natural anchor point as I move my astronaut around. If we were to move the anchor point out here, then when we change all the other transform values, it becomes much more awkward to work with. So we're going to leave it here at his chest. I'll just press Command Z to undo. So now I can place him according to our new anchor point. However, as I move across the timeline, we can see that he stays still for the duration of our composition. If we want him to move, we need to animate him by adding keyframes. I'm going to place the time indicator at about 30 seconds. Then I'm going to head over to the position control and click on the stopwatch. This adds a keyframe. Now, at that point in our timeline, the position will have this exact value. So if we move our time indicator to about 10 seconds, then come up to our composition and change the position again, this will add another keyframe. Since our astronaut's position has a different value at 10 seconds than it does at 30, our astronaut will spend the 20 seconds in between those keyframes moving from one value to the next. We can see this visualized by the path of the anchor point. You can see down here in the timeline when our time indicator is over the keyframe. So I'm just going to move my astronaut outside the frame of the composition so that he floats in from off screen. We can add keyframes to anything in After Effects that has a stopwatch by it. As you can see, this includes all of our other transform controls. Let's add keyframes to our rotation. So we click the stopwatch to create the first keyframe, move down the timeline, then change the value again to automatically create a second keyframe. Now our astronaut will rotate a little bit as he floats across the screen. If we move our time indicator off of one of the existing keyframes, we can use our arrow tool to move our astronaut image around. And as we do this, we create another keyframe. And you can see what the change in the value does for the object's path. We can use these handles to alter the path in case we want the astronaut to move in a slightly different way. Now, in order to play back our composition, After Effects must take some time to render the frames for playback. There are two ways to play back our composition. The first is to press the space bar. This will begin a playback from the time indicator's current position, but After Effects will be rendering the frames as it goes, indicated by the green bar on top of the timeline here. You can see up here that this is not real time. The other way to preview our composition is to do a RAM preview. If you press 0 on the keypad, this will begin a RAM preview, which starts from the beginning of your composition. You can get a glimpse of this from our preview window up here to the right and see that our preview is playing back in real time. So now that we've got a good thing going with our astronaut, let's add some more to the scene. I'm going to take my Earth map image and drop it into my timeline. I'll just leave it on top for now. What I want to do is take this flat image and create the illusion that it is a 3D planet. We're going to do that using one of After Effects' effects presets. After Effects comes with a full library of effects that you can apply to almost any file in your composition. Some of them are relatively self-explanatory, and some are not. So in order to fully grasp what each one can do, the best thing to do is to just go through each one and mess with it. The effect we're going to start with is called CC Sphere. So head over to the Effects and Presets window and type into the search bar CC Sphere, and you'll find it under Perspective. We're going to click that effect and drag it on top of our Earth map. If we look up here where the project window was, you can see that we now have an Effects Controls window. Let's go ahead and make the Earth a little bit bigger. We can change the color of the light and the direction it's coming from as well. We can come up here to the rotation and see that we can rotate our image around the sphere. If we rotate around the y-axis, we get the effect that Earth is rotating around its axis in space. So we're going to move the Earth over to this corner, then move the Earth layer under the astronaut so that our Earth is between our astronaut and space. If we use our Transform drop-down menu, you see that we still have all the same transform controls for our Earth, even though we've applied this effect to it. If you don't want to use the drop-down menu each time, you can also use keyboard shortcuts to pull up each transformation attribute. Having clicked on the file in the timeline, you press S for scale, P for position, R for rotation, and T for opacity. Remember, as I said before, anything with a stopwatch in front of it can be keyframed. This means we can animate the effects controls as well. Let's set a keyframe for Y rotation, scrub forward to the end of our comp, and change the value so that for the length of our comp, the Earth will have a slight rotation. Now that we have this scene put together, we can add an adjustment layer. Right-click on the timeline and choose New Adjustment Layer. The adjustment layer will allow us to add an effect to every layer underneath it all at once. For example, if we add a color correction effect to the adjustment layer, we can alter the colors of all 3 layers at once rather than one at a time. This Earth sphere has a light on it, but we have no source of light in our scene as it is. So why don't we add one by adding a lens flare? We're going to go to the Effects and Presets and type in Lens Flare. Now we can get the effect that there's a light source in the scene. We can move the flare to the center, change the flare brightness, etc. And of course, just as before, we can keyframe all of these attributes. So let's have our lens flare start out small, then slowly get bigger as it comes around our Earth. If you press the shortcut key U, you can pull up all of your keyframes for each of your layers, including those for the effects applied. So if you click on all the layers and press U, you can see all the keyframes in our composition so far. We can scrub through our timeline and see our Earth rotate, our lens flare animate, and our astronaut float across. This looks pretty good, but there's one more thing we can do to make this scene look even better. Up here in our toolbar, we have our Puppet Pin tool. The Puppet Pin tool can be applied to a still image to move sections of the image individually, like a puppet. So making sure we have our astronaut selected, we'll select the puppet pin tool and then click once on the astronaut to create our first pin. As we continue clicking and adding pins, we create points at which we can skew the original image. We can open up our puppet, mesh, deform, and see each of our puppet pinpoints, each of which has created a keyframe at the point in the timeline where we first created the pinpoints. If we select each of these pinpoints individually, we can warp the image to make it look like our astronaut is moving his limbs. Of course, as we move each pin, it creates a new keyframe for that pinpoint. So with our timeline indicator here, let's move these pinpoints around a bit until our astronaut is in a different position. And now you can see these pinpoints will animate each part of the astronaut image individually to look as if his limbs are moving. We can click and drag our arrow to select all of these keyframes, and then click and drag again to move the keyframes to a different point in our timeline. Now the astronaut's limbs will move with him as he floats across the screen. As with any project file, we need to save our progress, so Command S will bring up your Save As screen. I'm going to call this Space Project and save it in the same folder where my image and video files are, and then click Save. Now, we don't have our astronaut on screen until right about here at 15 seconds, so I'm going to trim the ends of this layer down to the beginning and the end of this animated segment. That way we can see when our astronaut is going to be on screen without having to open up the layer and look at the keyframes. We can also click and drag this layer to move this segment across our timeline to have our astronaut appear earlier or later in the composition. So we have a bar up here that represents our work area. We can move this over to a specific part of the timeline in order to focus our work in that area. When you play back or RAM preview, only the work area will be rendered out. So for now, let's move our astronaut to the last minute of our comp and focus our work area on the first minute. One thing we can do to enhance our workflow is to reduce the quality of our preview. If we come to the bottom of our comp window where it says full and change that to quarter, now our preview will be only in quarter quality, but it will render out much faster. In the first minute of our comp, we're going to add and animate some text. Click on the text tool in your toolbar, then click and drag onto the composition for space to place your text. I'm going to be using this quote. "The earth is the cradle of the mind, but we cannot live forever in a cradle." I just think it's a really cool quote, and it sort of co-lines with the whole astronaut in space aspect, so that's the quote I'm going to use. I only want half of the quote to show up at a time, so I'm only going to type the first half of the phrase for now. We can select these eyeballs on our timeline to make certain layers invisible so that we can focus on one thing at a time, so I'm going to go ahead and do that for my text layer. There are many ways to alter and customize the way that our text looks. Besides changing the font and the color, we can stretch it and skew it, change the character width and the height, all with these fun little character controls over here in our character window. I'm going to right-click on the text and choose Create Shapes from Text. This creates what's called a shape layer on top of the text layer, which is now invisible. If we open up the shape layer, we can see the shapes are made up of each of the letters from the text layer. Now, we want to be able to edit these whole words together, not just one letter at a time. So I'm going to select all the letters of the, then press Command G to create a group of letters. Then I'm going to right-click, rename, and rename each group according to the word. I'm going to go ahead and go through and do this for each word. Now, if I click on each letter, you notice that the anchor point for the letter is in the center of the comp and not the center of the letter, which is very problematic once we start animating. So I highly recommend taking the time to go through each letter and use that pan behind tool that we used earlier to move the anchor point to about the center of each letter. So now that that's done, I can move each of these words individually, and I can also hide each group with the eyeball icon, just like I can do with each layer. I can also edit each letter individually. This obviously adds for a whole lot of flexibility and creativity. So we're going to go ahead and create some very, very basic kinetic typography. So now that we have this set up to where we can animate each of our words separately, the easiest way to go about doing this is to set each of our words how we want them to appear whenever the entire sentence is on screen. So we're going to start at the end and sort of move backwards. So I'm going to go ahead and scale up Earth, and then I'm going to put it in the upper right-hand corner. Then I'm just going to put the up here. Then I'm going to go ahead and bring up all the rest of my words. And I'm just going to place them using my arrow tool kind of where I want them to end up. So for the word cradle, I kind of want the word cradle to be curved to sort of resemble a cradle. So I'm going to come down here and move all of my anchor points to actually the bottom of each letter instead of the middle. And then when I scale up these letters, I can scale them up from the bottom rather than the middle, and that way it creates a curve on top and stays flat on the bottom. If I double click on a shape layer, I can actually go in and edit each of these points that make up the shape. So I'm going to do this to slightly alter the shape of each of these letters so that I can sort of create a curve on the top of this word to sort of resemble a cradle. So once I have that done, I'm going to zoom out and go ahead and scale it up. So just like before, when I went in and changed the anchor point of each of the letters of the word cradle, I'm actually going to select the entire group of the word cradle, and I'm going to move that anchor point to the top instead of the bottom. So now the anchor point for my entire group of shapes is up at the top. I'm going to go back to my arrow tool, and I'm just going to place the rest of these words sort of where I want them. So since the phrase is cradle of the mind, I actually want the word cradle to sort of resemble a cradle, and then the word mind to actually be inside the word cradle. So the word cradle is literally cradling the mind. Super creative, I know. So I'm just going to place that right there, and I'm going to sort of just take the time to put each of these words exactly where I want them before I start adding any animation to them. So I actually want to do something very specific with the words cradle and mind that I don't want to be able to do to the rest of the words. So what I'm going to do is actually duplicate this shape layer. And then in one of the layers, I'm going to delete the words cradle and mind. Then I'm going to come in here and delete all the other words except for cradle and mind. So now the earth is the of the, all those words are on one shape layer, and the words cradle and mind are on their own shape layer. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because I want to be able to animate the words mind and cradle in 3D space. So now that I have the words mind and cradle on their own shape layer, separate from all the other words, I can go ahead and press this box underneath this cube right here, which makes the entire layer a 3D layer. Now, if I open up my transform controls for my 3D layer, you will see that I have similar transform controls, but I have added controls. I can now move this entire layer in 3D space. So I have rotation controls on the XYZ axis. The position controls are on the XYZ axis. The anchor point controls are on the XYZ axis. So I'm going to go ahead and take this anchor point and move it to the top center of the word mind. And now you see I can rotate the word mind and cradle along the x-axis, and it's sort of swinging, much like a cradle. So I'm going to go ahead and set a keyframe for this layer for the X rotation and the opacity. But then I'm going to go ahead and close this layer and come back to my other shape layer with all the rest of my words. I'm going to open these up, and I'm going to find the opacity for each of these layers and go ahead and set a keyframe for that. I'm going to move the keyframe forward, scrub back, and change the opacity to 0. And then I'm going to move these keyframes to where they're pretty much right next to each other. Oh, just like 1 frame difference. I'm going to make sure the keyframe set to 0 is before the keyframe set to 100. And now, over the period of 1 frame, the opacity is going to go from 0 to 100, so the word's just going to kind of pop on screen. I'm actually going to go ahead and do this for every single group of letters, so for every word. So I'm going to go into my earth. I'm going to set a keyframe for 100. I'm going to move it forward a little bit. Then I'm going to change the opacity to 0 to set another keyframe. Make sure those keyframes are right next to each other. And voila, the word earth just sort of pops on a screen. I'm going to go ahead and do this for every single one of these words. And then we're going to want to time these keyframes to where each word will pop up when the mind would sort of naturally be looking for the next word. So after we set all these keyframes, we're going to go ahead and just click and drag to select both of the keyframes rather than just one, and then just drag them around the timeline until they're timed to your liking. So now we're going to go into our cradle and mind layer, and we're just going to do the same thing. Set one keyframe with the opacity at 100, then go back a frame, and set the opacity to 0. So then space them out so that they appear on screen one at a time in time with the rest of the sentence. So now that I have that done, the words will pop up one at a time in the order of the sentence so that it makes sense when we read it. But now I want to add a little bit more animation. So now I'm going to go back to this 3D layer and go ahead and utilize this 3D aspect. So I'm going to go to the transform options of the entire layer. Notice I'm not in the transform options of either of the specific words. These are the transform options for the entire layer. So I'm going to set that X rotation keyframe at 0, and I'm going to drag it over to about 10 seconds. And then I'm going to push this back to right as the word cradle has 100% opacity. Then I'm going to change the X rotation to about 90 degrees. So now you can see that we have it animated to where the word will sort of fall onto the screen. So I'm going to push forward about a couple seconds and then change this X rotation to about -40 degrees so that it'll swing forward and then swing back. So we move it again, 2 seconds, move this X rotation back, and we're just going to keep doing this to create the effect that the word is rocking back and forth in a cradle. And so when we play this back, we see we get this sort of rocking effect. But it doesn't really look like it's rocking so much as it's just moving. So we're going to select all these keyframes, right-click, go to Keyframe Assistant, Easy Ease Keyframe. It completely depends, of course, on the effect that you're trying to create. But more often than not, this Easy Ease keyframe allows for movement that's a lot more natural. So I'm going to go ahead and type the next half of the sentence, which is, but we cannot live forever in a cradle. So now I have to figure out how I'm going to go from one half of the sentence to the next. I want to be able to move both of these shape layers that make up the first half of the sentence, and I want them to move together. I don't want them to move independently. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to parent the 3D layer, the words cradle and mind. I'm going to parent them to my 2D layer, which is the rest of my sentence. The earth is the of thee. And I'm going to do this by going to this little spiral over here next to the word none, and this is called the pick whip. So I'm going to click on the pick whip of the cradle mind layer, and I'm going to drag it to the other shape layer. So now that I've parented the shape layer that has the words cradle and mind with the shape layer that has the rest of my sentence, I can animate the shape layer with the rest of the sentence, and the words cradle and mind will follow suit. I'm going to move this anchor point to the whole of the letter R. So I'm going to use these skills that we've just learned, that is, changing the values of the transform controls and adding keyframes to go ahead and finish this text animation. I'm going to create this effect where we sort of zoom into the word earth, and the curve of the R is going to sort of rock to continue this cradle theme that we created with the first half of our sentence. So once I create this rocking animation with the curve of the R, I can go ahead and move on to the second half of the sentence and start adding those words to our animation. So I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to right-click and click Create Shapes from Text. So now we have a shape layer exactly the same as the shape layer we created before, except of course with different words. I'm going to go through again and move the anchor point of each of these letters so that it's at the center of the letter and not the center of the text. I'm going to go ahead and group all of the letters to where they're in the appropriate words. And now you see I can move these around just like we had them before. So I'm going to go ahead and place these words where I want them to end up. Then I'm going to go ahead and go into each group and keyframe the opacity to where each word comes up one at a time, just like we did for the first half of the sentence. And then when I have all of these words popping up on screen when I want them to, then we can just do like we did before, parent it. So I'm going to go ahead and press Command D to duplicate this layer just like we did with the first half of our sentence so that we can split "but we cannot live forever" from "in a cradle." We're going to rename this "in a cradle" so that we know what we're dealing with. And then for these three words, I just want to wrap them around our earth. So I'm just going to go into each of these layers and I'm going to change the position of the words so that I can kind of get them around the earth. So I'm going to have to actually go in and rotate each of these letters rather than the whole word. So I'm just going to do that, and one at a time I'm going to change the rotation of each letter until it looks how I want it to look. I'm going to go ahead and change this anchor point of this in the cradle layer so that the anchor point is the center of the earth, so that when I rotate this entire phrase in a cradle, it will spin around the earth. So I'm just going to have it kind of spin in here. And now I'm going to go back to my previous phrase where we have our "cannot live forever" rocking with our letter R. And I'm just going to go ahead and fix this to where it just sort of swings off screen. Change these points on my shape, and then I'm going to use the rotation. And you can see I'm doing this using all the same tools that we've been using. I'm just setting keyframes for our transform controls and then changing the values until I can get these words to do what I want them to do. I'm going to go ahead and add the name of the guy who said this, just to give him credit. His name is Konstantin E. Tsiolkovsky. Tsiolkovsky. Konstantin E. Tsiolkovsky. I don't know. I just have to type it. I don't have to say it. Except I did just have to say it for you. But anyway, I just want to keep this part really simple, so I'm just going to come in here and wrap his name around the earth to match the words "in a cradle." Of course, as you saw me have to do with the word cradle, I'm going to have to go in here and actually change the rotation of each of these letters individually. So go into Super Saiyan editing mode here. Okay, so now that we've done that, I'm just going to come into the Constantine layer, this shape layer with Constantine's name in it. And I'm just going to have it fade up right about when In a Cradle lands in its place. So now that I have all of this text animated in the way that I want it, I can see that the end of this sequence is going to be about right here. So I'm going to Shift Select to select all of these shape layers with my letters in them. Edit, Split Layer, and I'm just going to press Delete. And now all of these layers will end at the exact same time. So now if we play back these first few seconds, we can see we've created this pretty nifty little text animation kinetic typography little bit here to sort of introduce what the rest of our video is going to look like. Now you see we have all this extra space in between the end of our text and the beginning of when our astronaut comes on. So, like I did before, I can just select my astronaut layer and move him on over. And now he's going to appear right about at the end of my text. And there he is. I'm actually going to go in and select all of these layers that I split earlier, and I'm going to press T to bring up opacity. And I'm going to set a keyframe at 100 right here for all 4 layers, and then I'm going to move forward about 2 seconds and bring them all down to 0. And that way they'll all slowly fade off as my astronaut floats onto screen. So now that I sort of have this little sequence here done, I'm going to go ahead and select all of these layers, just with Shift Select, and then I'm going to go to Layer, Precompose. I'm going to call this Text and Astronaut, and then I'm going to press OK. So now if we come back into our project bin, you see that I've actually created another composition, and this composition is called Text and Astronaut. So if we select our space project composition, which we already have selected, and you double click on that, then you can see in your timeline that the only thing that exists in this space project composition is our text and astronaut composition. So then if you double click to open up our text and astronaut composition, then you'll see all the layers that we did before. So what I've done here is created a composition within another composition, also known as a pre-comp. And this is going to allow me to sort of have multiple scenes and sort of have multiple things going on within the same composition, and it's just going to make editing and compositing it all together much easier. So let's move on. Now we're going to start working with footage. We're going to go to our video folder here in the project window and find our green screen footage file. You're probably familiar with the prospect of filming someone in front of a green screen and then keying out the green in order to composite the footage within a different setting. That's exactly what we're going to do. I'm just going to take this and drag it into our workspace. Here we have a nice piece of footage with our wonderful, amazing talent here that is, man, just killing it, looking off into the distance like a champ. I have a big long piece of footage here and I don't want to use all of it, so I'm going to find the place in the footage where I want it to start and then drag the front of the layer over. Then I'm going to scrub forward until I start laughing again. Then I'm going to go Edit, Split Layer. Then I'm going to do the same thing in order to get a second clip. So now we have 2 clips of this green screen footage that we want to use for our project. I'm going to select both of these layers, then go to Layer, Precompose, so that now we have a pre-comp made up of these 2 clips. Double-click on the pre-comp to open it up. I want the length of the pre-comp to coincide with the length of these clips, so I'm going to move our work area, then right-click, Trim Comp to Work Area. Now our comp is exactly the length that we want it. Back inside the pre-comp, you can select these footage layers and use our shortcut keys to bring up all the same transform controls that we had before with our image layers, our text layers, and our shape layers, scale, position, anchor point, etc. We'll go ahead and get rid of the green screen using our keying effect. Having one of these clips selected, go to Effects, Keying, and you see we have a lot of different keying effects options, but we're going to go with Keylight. Now we'll go into our effects controls and use the color picker to select the green. Now everything in the footage that was green is now transparent. Again, just like with any other effect you can apply, the effects control window will show you all of your options for tweaking each effect. You can use these settings to adjust your keylight to give a better key. You can even do some color correction within the keylight effect. I'm going to go ahead and right-click New Solid to create a new black solid layer that will just act as a background. So rather than just applying that to the footage layer, I'm actually going to use Ctrl-X to cut the keylight effect, then go into my Space Project comp, select the comp that includes all of the green screen footage, then use Ctrl-V to paste. Now the keylight effect applies to the entire comp rather than just one layer of footage. Now I'm going to select my close-up comp, right-click, rename to green screen, so that I know that this comp is specifically my 2 green screen clips. Then I'm going to select the green screen and the black solid layer and go to Layer, Precompose, and call this Close-Up. Now I realize this is a lot of comps within comps, but the more that we start doing, the more that we're going to see how this organization is going to help us out later. As I mentioned before, you can use the Keylight effect to do some color correction on your keyed footage, so we're just going to mess with these colors a bit until it looks like what we want. We're actually going to put this floating head inside a sort of futuristic space helmet, ideally making her the astronaut from our previous comp. So we're going to go for an orange hue to match the astronaut's gold helmet. Now we're going to add a bunch of cool stuff inside the helmet to make it all futuristic. We'll start by right-clicking on the timeline to create a new solid layer, but this time we're going to change the dimensions to make it square. Then, having the solid layer selected, we're going to go to Effect, Generate, Grid. The result of this effect is probably pretty obvious. It generates a grid. So I'm going to go ahead and change the color of the grid. Now I'm actually going to duplicate the grid effect, which means that our grid effect is applied twice to the same layer. I'm going to change the blending mode of the second grid to Stencil Alpha. Now if I move the center point here in our workspace, we can see the effect of this blending mode. Blending modes simply affect the way that the layer blends with all of the layers behind it. In this case, it's affecting the way the first grid blends with the second grid, which creates this cool little interesting effect. Now I'm going to make my grid layer 3D by clicking on this box under the cube in my timeline. We touched on 3D a bit before, but we're going to go into much deeper detail with working with 3D space now. As you can see, I can move this grid around in 3D space now rather than just in 2D space like before. I can rotate it, move it forward and backward, just like before when we were working with our word cradle. Now I'm going to use an image that I have to create this illusion that this head is actually inside a helmet. I'm going to go to my project window, find this metal texture image file, then drag it to my timeline underneath everything except the black solid. Then I'm going to use my CC Sphere effect to project this texture as a sphere. I'm going to hide all the other layers using this eyeball button, then use these effects controls to rotate the image, move the light, scale it up, and add a hue until it looks like it could be the inside of a helmet. Since we are inside a helmet, I want it to look like there's not a lot of light coming in. Maybe I want a lot of light on the eyes and not so much on the edges of the face. So I'm going to create this shadow effect using a mask. Masks can be very powerful, and you'll see why a little later on. If you add a mask to a layer, it will hide and reveal certain pieces of the layer according to the mask's settings. So I'm just going to duplicate this black solid, then bring it up here where it's on top of everything. Making sure I have this black solid layer selected, I'm going to come up to the toolbar and select the Shape tool. Then I'm going to draw a shape right on top of this layer. This will create my mask, and as you can see, it's hiding the portion of my layer outside of the mask's borders and only revealing what's inside the mask. I can use my arrow tool to move my mask where I want it. Now I'm going to use my drop-down menu to go into the black solid, find mask, and where it says add, I'm going to change it to subtract. Now the mask has the opposite effect from before. So now if I double click inside the mask, I can move these path points just like I could when we were working with the shape layers from our text. Though they work in very different ways, layer masks and shape layers can be created and adjusted using the same tools. So once we have the mask where we want it, I'm going to go into my mask settings. You'll see I have the options to adjust settings that are specific to the mask itself, such as mask feather, opacity, and expansion. Alright, let's go back and focus on the grid. As I mentioned, we made this grid layer 3D, which means it can move around in 3D space. What I haven't mentioned is that After Effects will actually composite these things in 3D space, and you can see it do just that through different camera angles. Let me show you what I mean. If we come to our project window and select where it says Active Camera, you'll see that you have multiple camera options. So let's select one of these other cameras. Now we can see what our scene looks like from the top. Since our grid layer and our green screen layer are the only things that have been made 3D layers, those are the only two layers that we can see from these other camera angles. Let's come over here to where it says one view and change it to 2. Now we can see our active camera and another angle at the same time. Using these multiple views and different camera angles can help you make sense of working in this 3D environment, which can sometimes be very confusing. But as you can see, as we move around our 3D layer, we can see how it moves in 3D space from all these different angles. So I want this grid to rotate on its y-axis just like this, to act as a sort of in-helmet reference grid. But since we're just special effects people and not scientists, we don't really care how it moves. We just want it to move randomly. So After Effects has a tool for that called the Wiggler. The Wiggler is awesome because it can help you add organically random movement to your objects very quickly and simply. So to use it, we're going to go to Window, Wiggler, and it shows up down here in the right-hand corner. Since I only want the Y rotation to be wiggling, I'm going to create a keyframe for the Y rotation in my timeline at the beginning of the sequence, and then one at the end. Although you can see I'm only working with the first half of this footage right now. Then I'm going to shift select both of these keyframes, come over to my Wiggler, and click Apply. Now After Effects has applied a bunch of random keyframes for me. However, it's not quite the movement I'm going for, so I'm going to Command Z to undo, and then adjust the magnitude and the frequency accordingly until I get just the perfect amount of random movement from this Wiggler. So as you remember, we added this second grid effect to the solid to create this pattern that moves as we move our corner point. Anything with a stopwatch can be keyframed, and almost anything that can be keyframed can be wiggled. So I'm going to press the stopwatch and add the first keyframe, then I'm going to press U, and that will bring up the keyframe in the timeline. Scrub to the end, create another keyframe, and select both keyframes, then click Apply on the Wiggler. So now we have random pattern movements happening on our grid. So as you can see, the Wiggler can be very powerful, and we're going to be using a lot of it to create this heads-up display effect within our little futuristic space helmet. Let's work a little bit more with masks. I'm going to create another square solid. I'm going to double-click the oval shape tool to create a perfect circle mask out of my perfect square solid. I can press the shortcut key M to bring up my mask. Control D to duplicate. Change the duplicate mask to subtract. Move the expansion of the second mask in. Now I've created a perfect circle. Duplicate the mask again and adjust the expansion again. Duplicate the mask once more, adjust that expansion. Now I've created a couple of circular shapes all with one white solid and a whole bunch of masks. Now I'm going to grab the pen tool up here in the toolbar, and I'm going to create a fifth mask. I'm going to click on the layer to create the mask path points that cut out sections of these circles. Change it to subtract, and I'm going to do it again. Now that I have this weird circle thing created from one solid with a bunch of masks, I'm going to close all the masks and open up the transform controls of my solid layer. As I rotate my whole layer, you can see these masks will move with it. So I'm going to duplicate this entire layer, then go into the second white solid layer and change the scale, then rotate that one around to where it's independent from the first. Now I'm going to make both of these solids 3D, then select both layers and press R to pull up the rotation controls. I'm going to add keyframe to the beginning and the end of the sequence to the Z rotation. Then select the beginning and end keyframes, adjust my wiggle settings, and apply. Do the same for the second white solid layer. Now I'm going to press P to pull up position and move the second layer back in 3D space, then scale it up again. Now I'm going to go to Active Camera and select Custom View, then go up to my toolbar and select the Camera tool. Now I can use this tool to move freely around in my 3D space and my Custom View to look at how my objects are positioned in 3D space. I'm going to go back to my Active Camera. I'm going to bring the opacity of my grid and my white solids down to about 15 to 20%. Now I have all these little things inside my helmet moving around with computer-generated randomness. Possibly the coolest aspect of working in After Effects is how it correlates with the rest of the software in the Adobe Creative Suite. You can import files from Photoshop, Illustrator, Premiere Pro, and Flash and incorporate all of them very easily into your After Effects composition. I'm going to start by opening up a Photoshop file. When I create a new Photoshop file, I'm going to make sure it has the same settings as my composition in After Effects. In this case, it's HDTV 1080p, and I want to make sure my background is transparent. Now I've created this image in Photoshop that's nothing more than a simple bar graph, but each of these bars in the graph is one separate layer, so keep that in mind. I'm just going to save this in my image folder, then exit Photoshop and go back to After Effects. File, Import, then import the PSD file. Right here where it says Import As, I'm going to make sure I change that to Composition. Open. Now it's going to ask me if I want to import this file with editable layers or with merged layers. I want the editable layer styles, and I'll show you what that means. Now we see our bar graph here, and if you notice the icon, this bar graph is actually a composition rather than a single image. If we double click, we see that our file has retained all of the same layers from the Photoshop project file, and we can edit each of these layers individually, which is exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to go through and move the anchor point of each of these bars in our bar graph to the bottom of the bar, rather than in the middle of the composition. Then when I press S to pull up the layer scale, I'm going to click on this chain link here to unlink the scaling proportions. Now when I scale along the Y-axis, the bar goes up and down. Guess what? I want it to go up and down randomly, so I'm going to go ahead and add a keyframe at the beginning, then at the end, make sure my wiggler is set to only change the Y dimension, then select the keyframes and click Apply. The unfortunate thing about the wiggler effect is that you can't mass apply the effect, so in order to have all of these bars each go up and down at random, I'm going to have to apply the wiggler effect to each bar layer individually. It's very tedious, but the resulting effect can be very cool. So now if I go back to my close-up comp, I have my randomly moving bar graph in addition to my circles and my grid. The bar graph comp is much longer than our close-up comp, so we're going to go in here and adjust our work area to about 8 seconds, then right-click, trim comp to work area. Back in my close-up comp, I'll select the bar graph comp and press S to scale it. The thing about After Effects is that there's a whole lot of layering going on. You've got comps within comps within comps. We've got masks within layers. We've got shapes within layers. It's very much like Inception. It's really easy to get confused if you don't stay organized, so make sure everything's labeled and whatnot. I'm going to change my bar graph opacity to about 25%, and then I'm going to right-click and find blending mode, then choose Add. I'm going to make my bar graph a 3D layer and then collapse it. So we can do the same thing with Illustrator files that we did in Photoshop files. I have this Illustrator file that has different pieces of this target, each on a separate layer. We're going to save it to our images and then import it, and just like with a Photoshop file, we're going to make sure we do it as comp and not as footage. Bring this down to our close-up comp, double-click, we have all these layers in here. What I'm actually going to do with this is select all of these layers, then Control-X to copy them, come into my close-up comp, then Control-V to paste them, and then make all of these layers 3D. Now, I want this target to be a 3D target, so I'm going to go into my two views, and I'm going to move all these pieces of my target around in 3D space. These circles are going to be easy because I can just move them back and forth. I'm going to move these two white circle layers to align with these target layers. Now, the tricky part of this target is that I'm going to make these little grid things. I'm going to take them and I'm going to place them in 3D space as well. I'm going to move it up here and then rotate it until it's at this angle in 3D space. If I go into my custom view, I can see what this looks like. I'm going to switch into 4-camera view and then place the rest of my target pieces that way, all in 3D space, all while making sure everything is to scale in my active view camera down here in the bottom left corner. Once I have all those pieces of the target placed in 3D space, I'm going to go ahead and head back to my one view with my active camera. I'm going to select all these target layers, then go into Effects, Generate, Fill. This will allow me to change the fill color of the opacity of these target layers all at once. I'm going to change these layers blending mode to Add as well. I'm going to move this bar graph into the top left corner, then create yet another solid square. I'm going to go to my Shape tool and find the rounded rectangle shape and draw a rounded rectangle mask on my new solid layer. Then I'm going to duplicate the mask, change one mask to subtract, just like we did when we were making all those white circles, only instead of changing the expansion, I'm going to change the feathering to create this sort of translucent screen thing going on. I'm going to right-click, Precompose this new solid layer, and right-click to rename the precomp and call it Messages. Double-click on Messages and we go into the precomp. I'm going to add text layers on top of this little screen here. I'm going to have it say Incoming. Use my character window to adjust the text to make it look however I want, whatever font I want. Actually, I want this to say System Processor. I'm going to create another text layer and I'm just going to fill it with random numbers. Again, we are visual effects artists, we are not scientists, so this means nothing to us. It's only important that it looks cool. One thing we can do to edit our text is open up our text layer, click the drop-down arrow next to text, click over here where it says Animate, and choose Character Offset. Now, if you go to Animator 1, you can see that you can keyframe your character offset, and as you change the value, it changes the character. So we're just going to set one keyframe at the beginning and one at the end, and change the character offset value, and these numbers will change randomly as we play back. I'm just going to add some more text down here. System satisfactory, that's always good. So now we'll head back to our close-up comp and find our message pre-comp sitting nicely on top of everything else. We'll adjust the opacity, change blending mode to Add, just like we did with our other layers. I'm going to make this pre-comp 3D. Then I'm going to rotate this around in 3D space so that the text is actually facing me inside the helmet. I'm going to move the bar graph as well. Now, I really need to stay organized and pre-comp these target layers, so I'm going to select these Illustrator layers as well as these two white solid layers with my circles. Right-click, Precompose, and call it Target. However, when I do this, I have to make sure I come over here and click the Collapse Transformation box. If we go into our custom view, we can see that our target comp is retaining all of its 3D aspects. If we didn't click on Collapse Transformation, then our target comp would appear flat in our close-up comp. I'm actually going to go through to my other little inner helmet doohickeys here and add some third dimension details to them as well. Then I'm going to click that Collapse Transformation box on them to preserve their 3D aspects as well. So now I got this super awesome inner helmet heads-up display going on. I want to add a camera. After Effects has the ability to render in reference to different camera settings. So we're going to go to Layer, New, Camera. If you're familiar with cinematography, then this stuff probably makes a lot of sense to you. I'm not, so it really doesn't. But just know that we're creating a scene inside of a helmet, so we want a camera with a small lens. So this small lens is going to recreate a wide-angle lens effect, so we're going to go with that. So now you can see our camera here in our timeline, and it interprets all this 3D stuff very differently than our default camera from before. So if we go into our multiple views, we can see how this stuff is lining up with our camera. Since our camera sits in our workspace now, we can actually use our arrow tool to position the camera where we want it. We can see in our active camera view what this looks like. We may need to adjust a few of these things accordingly. So now if we render out our scene, we see we got all these cool, crazy things happening inside of our helmet. Gadgets and gizmos aplenty. What I want to do is align this target up with my eyeball. If I just use my arrow tool, I can move it around in 3D space, but I need to go ahead and make this target comp a 3D layer. Press S to bring up scale and scale it up. Now I'm going to press P, Shift, R to bring up both position and rotation. Then I'm going to adjust these values until the target sort of lines up with my eye. My gadgets are all going to magically change color because I changed my mind about all the red, by the way. So now with all this stuff lined up, I'll go back into my camera and click the drop-down arrow for camera options. There's a lot of them. I'm going to find depth of field, turn it on, then find aperture and turn it up. This is going to recreate the depth of field effect that makes the stuff that's not in focus blurry. We're not going to add too much blurriness because that doesn't make a whole lot of sense for our tiny camera lens. A little is going to get our point across. I'm going to go to Layer, New, Null Object. Null objects are invisible objects in your comp that can be used for reference for other objects. They can kind of be used like controllers if you use them right. I'll show you what I mean. If we press P for position and add keyframes to the beginning and end of the sequence, we can apply the wiggler just like we've done a million times now. We're going to apply it to our invisible null object. Now if we parent our camera to our null object using this pick whip tool that we've used before, we can see that our camera will wiggle with our null object. This creates a cool shaky camera effect that I happen to be fond of. Now I'm going to come to my target comp layer and press P-Shift-R to bring up those position and rotation controls. I'm actually going to keyframe this to where it starts off screen, and then it lines up with my eye. This probably looks a little overwhelming at first, but keyframing this 3D object is just like keyframing the 2D astronaut, only now we just have one more dimension to work with. So now I have this cool inner helmet heads-up display going on. I went ahead and skipped the making of the second half of the sequence because I used all the same skills, so it didn't introduce anything new. I'm going to go ahead and add an adjustment layer to this close-up comp so that I can add a color correction effect to color correct all of these layers at once. I prefer to use this curves effect. We want it to be kind of a gold in order to look as if it's inside this astronaut's helmet. I'm also going to add this metal texture image again, change the blending mode to screen, bring the opacity down, add the CC sphere effect, bring it up, just to further emphasize the illusion that all of this takes place inside the astronaut's helmet. So let's head back to our space project comp, which now consists of two fully formed compositions. One is our astronaut, introduced by this text, and then one is this close-up inside the astronaut's helmet. Having this space project comp selected, I'm going to go to my composition, comp settings, reset the duration to be a little bit longer. Now we have some time to work within our timeline. So I'm going to move this comp over, bring in my workspace here. Then I'm going to go to my close-up comp. I'm going to find where the first clip ends and the second one begins. Then go to Edit, Split Layer. So now let's right-click New Composition and let's rename it Particles. Particles are the coolest, most powerful, most frustrating, confusing thing you will ever work with in After Effects. Let me show you. We'll go into our particle comp, right-click, New, Solid, make it black. This will just be our backdrop. I know black is boring, but we are in space after all. Make it comp size, click OK. Now add another solid and make it white. I'm going to call this Particle System. Head over to your effects and presets and type in the search bar Particles. You'll see you probably have several to choose from. We're going to go with CC Particle World. This creates what's known as a particle system. The particles are born out of this producer, and as you move along the timeline, they move according to the physics set by the particle system, and then they die. Just like with any other effect we create, we can come into our effects controls window and adjust the settings of the effect, which in this case includes the particle, the physics of the system, the particle producer, etc. Now, one thing worth noting is that even though these particles appear to be moving in 3D space, they actually are not. If we go into our custom view, we can see that these are actually on a flat plane. There are some particle systems that allow you to create particles in 3D space, but we're not working with them. So you don't get to see that. So I'm going to head over to the particle menu in my effects controls, and you can see that I can change my particle type. I'm going to go with Faded Sphere. I can also change the color, which I'm going to do. Now I'm going to go into physics, and since we're in space, it only makes sense that I set the gravity to 0. Now these particles are going to kind of fly at me instead of fall as they're being produced. I'm going to adjust the particle sizes a bit. Now, because of the way the particle system works, there's a point at the beginning where there are no particles because none have been produced yet. I'm just going to use my arrow tool to slide this layer over in my timeline so that at the beginning of my sequence, our first particles have already been created. Now I'm going to go into my producer and I'm going to scale the radius of the producer up. Now, instead of coming at me from a point, these particles are coming at me from this big space because that's how big the particle producer is. Now down here in the extras menu, I have this hold particle release, which is exactly what I would like to do with my particles. So I'm going to find a point in the timeline where I like the way that they look. Then I'm going to add a keyframe for hold particle release, set it to 0, move back in the timeline, and move it to 100. Now this will hold my particles 100% until it reaches that keyframe, at which time it will release my particles to create this kind of weird effect that I just so happen to like for the purposes of this exercise. Now I'm also going to keyframe the birth rate here so that it stops producing particles until that particle hold releases. Now I want to make sure the stars here look the same as my stars in my other comp, otherwise it's really not going to look like the same scene. I'm going to create an adjustment layer and go to Noise and Grain, add Grain, and then I can increase the density of the grain and everything in these effects controls. And now it looks a bit more like the same sky. Now, one super cool thing about the CC particle world is that you'll notice that there's a stopwatch next to particle type. That means I can keyframe it. So I'm going to add a keyframe for the faded sphere particle type, then nudge my time indicator forward, and then change particle type to line. Now my particle type will change and create this neat little effect here. Sort of resembles some sort of space explosion. Again, not a scientist here. In order to emphasize my space explosion, I'm going to add a white solid and then head over to my shape tool and find the star. Then I'm just going to click and drag to create a star mask on top of my solid layer. While I still have my mouse button pressed down, I'm going to press the arrow keys on my keyboard. And you can see that I can add or subtract points from my star this way. I'm going to move the mask to the center of the comp, scale it, and then I'm just going to go through the timeline and keyframe the mask's expansion and feather to create these little blips of white that sort of pop in and out. And since we've worked with a lot of masks already, I'm not really going to go into much detail with what I did here. So when I move my expansion of the mask all the way out, I can see that my white solid isn't really in the white place anymore earlier from when we centered it. So let's make sure we center our white solid layer and then reposition the actual mask. I'm going to create even more masks to create some aura rings to come from my explosion as well. All the same tools we've already gone over already, creating mask shapes, keyframing, the feather and the expansion, and the opacity. I'm also going to create another null object and then keyframe the position and apply the wiggler to it. Then I'm going to shift select all my other layers and use this pick whip to parent them to the null object. And now that whole scene has like a little camera wiggle. So let's head back to the space project comp, within which we now have 3 fully formed comps acting as different shots of the same scene. Our astronaut, our close-up, inside of our space helmet, and then our explosion. I'm just going to move all these comps around until they line up and time up the way that I want them to in order to sort of cut them together to create this whole scene here. So this is like our movie, or like a scene from our movie. Maybe it's like the movie trailer or something. It looks really cool. We've got comps on comps on comps. We're proud of what we've cut together here. What we really need to bring this scene together, though, is some sound effects. Working with sound in After Effects is not really the most intuitive process, but it can be done, so let's do it. I have a folder of sounds here that I need to go ahead and import, so let's do that. Open this up, we have a plethora of sound files. If we double click on these sound files from our project window, then they open up in our workspace just like any other file, except that this time there's no image because there's no image in an audio file. Now we can scrub through these and we actually won't hear anything right off the bat. That's because After Effects needs to use its RAM preview in order to generate sound for playback. So to be able to hear the audio while scrubbing through, you need to hold down the Command key while you're scrubbing through, and then you'll be able to hear it play back. Otherwise, you'll have to press 0 on the keypad for that RAM preview. So if we drag these audio files into our composition, we see it visualized down here just like any other layer. We can see the duration of the sound compared to the duration of our comp. Now, I know just as well as the next girl that there's no sound in space, but I think we're well beyond establishing a general lack of scientific accuracy here. So let's go ahead and add some noises just to make this sound just as interesting to the ear as it is to the eye. So if we listen to this wind sound file here, we have this weird car screech happening at the beginning. I don't really think that sound is very applicable to our scene, so I'm just going to use my arrow tool and drag the ends of the layer here in the timeline over until it's past that part and into the part where I just hear the wind. Then I'm just going to move it over, just like working with any other layer. So now we have this very empty wind sound happening underneath everything, but it's a little loud, so I'm going to head down here to my drop-down menu, and you see that since this is an audio layer, we no longer have these transform controls, we only have audio controls. So we can change the audio levels here. I'm just going to bring it down. This wind sound gets a lot louder here at the end, so I'm actually going to press the stopwatch to add a keyframe to the audio level. Then down here at the end, I'm going to bring the audio level down even more to set another keyframe, and now the audio level will slowly decrease so that my wind sound doesn't get too loud. I have this wood creaking sound file that I want to add over my swinging cradle word, so I'm going to drag it down here and put it right about where the word cradle starts. And that lines up pretty good. I want that creaking to stop when the word goes away, so I'm just going to put my time indicator here at the end of the word cradle swinging, then go to Edit, Split Layer, and just delete the rest. This is pretty much the extent to working with sound in After Effects. You can kind of just drag it and drop it into the timeline so that it lines up in the way that you want it to. I'm just going to use all these sound files that I have to add sound effects to my inner helmet close-up and my weird star explosion thing. As the explosion happens, I'm going to keyframe these audio levels to increase so that the scene starts off with small sounds and ends up really loud. And of course you can layer all these sound layers on top of each other and you'll still be able to hear all of them. And one thing I did here was I have this beep sound file, but there's just one beep in the audio file, and I want it to beep repeatedly in my scene. So I'm just going to use Command D and duplicate these beep layers until they stack up, and just stack them up until they go the length of my scene. Then I'm just going to Shift select all of these beep audio layers and go to Layer Precompose. So you see here within my beep precomp, I just place each beep layer closer together in order to gradually make the beeping happen faster. And now I can go back to my space project comp and I can keyframe the audio levels of my entire beep comp so that the beeps gradually get louder rather than trying to go through each beep layer and make each beep louder than the one before it. Okay, so now we're done. We have a full scene that we want to show off to the world, put on YouTube, get millions of hits, and get invited onto the Ellen Show. But before we can do any of that, we have to get our scene out of After Effects in order to be an independent movie file. To do this, we need to render and export our project. So making sure I have the space project comp selected, since that's the composition that holds my entire scene, I'm going to go to Composition, Add to Render Queue. This, of course, brings up my render queue. I'm going to click where it says lossless, and this is where we change our export settings. There are a few export settings that we're going to focus on specifically. Format is obviously a big one. We're going to go with H.264 since that's a format that's compatible with pretty much all media players as well as internet streaming. Over here we have our format options where we can change our bitrate settings. We're going to leave these as they are and just click OK. Here we can click this checkbox in order to resize our movie. We can see here that our default size of our movie is huge, which is going to take up a whole lot of space on our hard drive and will probably be too big to upload into any video sharing sites. So we're going to have to change the size to 1280 by 720. This makes our video smaller, which of course saves us some space and some time, but it will decrease the quality of the final output a little bit. Now, since we do have audio in our comp, we do need to check here that we want our comp to export the audio as well. Depending on what you want to do with your video, you may need to change the audio rate. For example, if you want to share your video on Vimeo, Vimeo specifies that they only support up to 44.1, so we're going to go with that. Here you can choose between stereo and mono. Over here for audio format, we're going to go with AAC, and you can also change the audio bitrate. I'm going to go with 320. Click OK and click OK. Now that we have our export settings set up, we can click here to specify our output location. I typically set it to export to the same folder that my project was in. So now we click Render. Once it's done, you can save and quit After Effects, find our folder, and see our MP4 file right here, and just double-click to watch the final product. Anyway, I hope you got what you wanted out of this tutorial. There are lots of resources out there for honing your After Effects skills. I recommend videocopilot.net. Those guys really know what they're talking about, and I will shamelessly admit that they were a huge inspiration for much of what happened here in this tutorial. So good luck in all of your After Effects endeavors.